If you are here for today's Meet the Author event, please come closer as we're about to begin.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon everybody. My name is John Holmes. I'm the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon to introduce an old colleague and a fellow refugee from the British Diplomatic Service, Ivor Roberts. Ivor and I were colleagues when he was ambassador in, well, various places, Yugoslavia before it was no longer Yugoslavia, Ireland, and then finally Italy, when I was ambassador in other places around Europe as well. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, Ivor, to see you here. And it's a great pleasure to be present for this signing and introduction of a new edition of Satow's Diplomatic Practice. I think it's the first revision for 30 years. I mean, the book was written itself more than 100 years ago, I guess. You'll tell us in a second, I'm sure, exactly what the details are. 90 years ago. So obviously it needs a lot of updating, but it's an absolutely basic volume for diplomats around the world, and therefore I think it's particularly appropriate to be helping to launch it here in the UN Bookshop. I think Ivor is an ideal person to do this because he's, I mean, not only a very long-standing diplomat, but he was also a rather undiplomatic diplomat in the best sense of the word, that he didn't always say what he should have done, which is what diplomats should do from time to time. So anyway, very good to see you here, Ivor, and let me, without any further ado, give you the floor to introduce the book.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, John, for those generous remarks. When I was taking over from a predecessor in my first diplomatic appointment, I found 3 envelopes in my drawer marked 1, 2 and 3 with a little note on top saying to be opened in turn in times of disaster. In opening envelope number 1, after my first blunder, I read, "Blame your predecessor." After the second fiasco, I opened number 2 to read, "Sack your assistant." And after the third, I read, "Prepare 3 envelopes." I knew it was time to move on. Well, with this book, I've no excuses. My predecessors from the prime begetter, Sir Ernest Satow, writing during the First World War after the most catastrophic failure of diplomacy, to Lord Paul Gore Booth writing 30 years ago, have left me a rich inheritance, which I hope hasn't been squandered. This new edition attempts to be a comprehensive manual for diplomats, from a short history of diplomacy to advice to diplomats with sections on protocol, precedents, the modern means of diplomatic exchanges from note verbal to email, privileges and immunities, the impact of global terrorism on diplomacy and diplomats, consular affairs, and the exponential growth in international organizations, alternative diplomacy, NGOs, back-channel diplomacy, and the usual treaties and conferences. Diplomacy hasn't always had the best of presses. For some, diplomacy is imagined as living in a Ferrero Rocher advert surrounded by flunkies, champagne and luxury chocolates. And for others, it's synonymous with doing deals with foreigners and letting down the home side and appeasing foreigners in the interests of realpolitik. Zbigniew Brzezinski once remarked, if foreign ministries didn't already exist, they surely wouldn't have to be invented. That leads on to questions such as who needs diplomats, or why bother with diplomacy? Well, I think that diplomacy can be seen as the obverse of Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is merely a continuation of politics by other means. And I think, in the words of Soviet Field Marshal Shaposhnikov, peace in its turn is no more than the continuation of conflict by other means. But pure diplomacy, by contrast, is essentially and basically the art of resolving conflict by non-violent means or without recourse to force. And that doesn't mean that the prospect of power should be entirely absent. As Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without power is like an orchestra without instruments. More recently, in this building, Kofi Annan said you can do a lot with diplomacy, but of course you can do a lot more with diplomacy backed up by fairness and force. Sometimes diplomacy gets crowded out by force and is regarded as an inconvenience to be observed only with the lips, while the real message is more akin to the lines addressed by the Athenian envoys to the citizens of Melos recorded in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. But that is to sell diplomacy short. Diplomacy is and should properly always be the conduct of business between states by peaceful means. And it must make sense to put modest amounts of money into preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution, rather than have to expend billions on a military mission and billions more on a reconstruction effort after the fog of war has cleared. Diplomacy has, of course, evolved dramatically since Thucydides' time. In practice, if not in basic concept, the IT revolution and air travel have made the most striking differences, particularly in the 30 years since the last edition of this work. Presidents, prime ministers, foreign secretaries, secretaries general now deal directly with each other, bypassing traditional channels. Does that make diplomats redundant? I don't think so. I think differences of language, culture, and historical perspective add to the geographical distance and can confuse or distort the task and perspective of the instant visitor unless the visit is carefully prepared and equally assiduously followed up. Advice on local circumstances and personalities can be crucial. Otherwise, all too often, the jet-setting minister can resemble a seagull, flying in, making a lot of noise, then flying out again, leaving a large mess behind. A former boss of mine, Christopher Ewart Biggs, who was tragically murdered by terrorists in the 1970s, wrote of the Paris embassy, the British embassy in Paris, where I served under him, about a summit meeting. He said, "One doesn't reach the summit without a base camp. The base camp is this embassy." And it's the modern diplomat's task to man the base camps. Less glamorous than the diplomacy of old, but no lack of fulfilling tasks to execute. I happen to agree with Brzezinski that a world without diplomats would be an improvement, but that would be a world I don't recognize. No wars, no conflicts to prevent, no nuclear proliferation threats, no terrorism, no tourists losing their passports or ending up in prison, a world of perfect free trade and all countries so prosperous that development aid wasn't necessary. I don't believe that world is on offer. Certainly Sir Ernest Satow didn't, believing instead that we're constantly facing in diplomacy a Sisyphean task. As far ahead as I can see, diplomacy will be needed, and I hope this book in its turn will meet a real need. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, does anybody have any questions for the author? If not, then we can start the book signing.